Ben McDaniel was courageous and wasn't a big fan of rules. Perhaps that's why he couldn't find a diving partner, and his solo night dives were no longer a surprise for the diving center employees. But everything changed when one day he decided to dive into a fatally dangerous underwater cave all by himself. Since that moment, no one has ever seen Ben McDaniel above or below the water's surface. The guy couldn't have just vanished without a trace, right? Or could he? An average run-of-the-mill guy from the state of Tennessee, Ben McDaniel might have never caught our attention if, at first, his life didn't hit a rough patch. First, in 2008, he lost his little brother Paul. Ben found him at home unconscious and tried to save him. But Paul died, as the doctors said, of a stroke. The exact cause of death came as another blow to McDaniel, an overdose of illegal substances. A bit later, his marriage and his business both fell apart. Ben was left with his dog and $50,000 tax debt. So, in 2010, the man's life looked pretty fitting for him to develop a desire to just disappear. But his parents offered him financial assistance and a sabbatical in their home in Santa Rosa Beach, Florida. Ben accepted that. There, he went right back into diving, which he'd loved since he was a teenager. And although the man's house was literally on the beach, he still decided to pursue his newfound passion at a local dive shop called Vortex Spring. Back then, he couldn't have imagined this would be the biggest mistake of his life. Vortex Spring is arguably the biggest diving center in Florida, with warm, fresh water. It's equipped with curious underwater diving routes for divers of varying levels. But the highlight of the facility is a natural underwater cave. It was this cave that caught McDaniel's eye. To get to the entrance, you have to dive to a depth of 18 meters. And for this, you have to have a diving license. Moreover, to enter the cave itself, you have to receive the underwater gate keys possessed only by the center employees. The thing is that in the 90s alone, 13 people died there, and the authorities wanted to block all access to the cave altogether. To avoid this, the center introduced a firm rule. You show a certificate of being an open water diver, you get the keys. McDaniel didn't like this regulation, but he didn't have the required documents and thus couldn't be authorized for access. But it isn't for nothing that visitors are welcomed by the Grim Reaper at the cave's entrance. The writing warns, "There is nothing in the cave worth dying for," and reminds us that over 300 people have died in the cave on record. So, what exactly makes this place so dangerous? It's because here, the spacious pool of the dive shop gives way to a narrow limestone cave. It lies almost horizontally at a depth at around 94 meters, and gradually becomes even narrower. In certain areas, the passages are so cramped that the divers have to take off their air tanks and push them in front of themselves. And the person has to literally crawl across the clay floor, pushing the stone ceiling with their back. The most skilled professionals have managed to explore about 490 meters of the cave's length and put them on the map. It's impossible to push further, as the passage barely reaches 25 centimeters in length. Although the cave doesn't end there, some believe it's possible to go farther, but not to go back, and everything points to Ben McDaniel wanting to ensure that for himself. The man became a regular at Vortex Spring. He often stayed until late in the evening and went on dives after sunset. On such days, center employees Chuck Cronin and Eduardo Taran waited for bubbles to appear on the water's surface. This meant that Ben was surfacing and starting the process of decompression. At a certain depth, people need a special gas mix for breathing, but it's dangerous above the surface. That's why the diver must relieve the body of excess nitrogen, helium, and other gases which have accumulated during the dive. The process is very simple. You just need to suspend yourself in the water at a certain depth for some time and breathe in the oxygen while noxious gases just escape through your lungs. That's why the dive shop workers understood Ben was starting his ascent when they saw bubbles on the water's surface. On August 18, 2010, Cronin and Taran saw Ben swimming around the cave since they often dove after working hours. Then, Taran personally opened the gate for McDaniel and watched him enter the cave. The diving center employee was sure Ben had repeatedly tried to break the metal fence. He decided it would be better to let McDaniel explore the cave than have him get tangled on the fence and die one day. Cronin believed that Ben had excellent equipment and was pretty knowledgeable about diving. but he also noticed McDaniel displayed excessive self-confidence. In any case, that evening, Ben ended up inside the cave, but instead of waiting for decompression bubbles, the center employees went to get a coffee at Tehran's place. Since then, Ben McDaniel hasn't been seen. The following day was a busy one at the facility, so the employees presumably didn't pay attention to whether Ben visited or not. Only in the morning of the following day, his car was spotted in the parking lot, but the man himself was nowhere to be found. Did Ben's neglect of rules and regulation cost him his life? The police who turned up at the facility had no answer to this question. The officers searched his car and found his phone and almost $1,000 in cash. There were no signs of a struggle near his pickup. Footage from surveillance cameras and information from the center employees proved on August 18th, Ben spent the whole day at Vortex Spring. In the afternoon, he dove into the cave's entrance and looked at it closely, according to other divers. Having surfaced, he filled his air tanks, which he kept to himself, checking equipment and making some notes. Later, it became known they were about the cave. In the evening, Ben called his mother, and when the sun started to set, he went for another dive. His parents told the police he had stayed with them the day before. After 4 months in Florida, he went back to Tennessee for a week. Ben told them he was studying cave diving and planning to get a certificate. He told his girlfriend he had plans to open a diving business. Returning to Florida, he left his parents a letter thanking them for the sabbatical and promising to take further care of them. McDaniel's hungry dog was found in his house, but there were no signs of the man himself or his diving gear. So the police suspected Ben never got back to the surface on August 18th. The cave got sealed and the exploration began. The news of the disappearance spread quickly and local divers started offering help. They thought this would be, so to say, a matter of a few days. And yes, almost immediately, there was a find of 3 air tanks belonging to McDaniel. Typically, they're left in different spots of a cave for decompression during a dive. This guarantees the diver an ample amount of the right kind of air when they are resurfacing. But the air in Ben's tanks turned out to be the wrong kind. For deep immersion, special mixes are used. This is necessary for survival, but McDaniel's tanks were filled with regular air. If he had really been studying diving and planning to dive into the cave, he would have considered that. Apart from this, the tanks were found at the very beginning of the route. 2 of them were in the so-called piano room, and the third one was even closer to the exit. The divers started moving through the cave, searching every nook and cranny, where Ben could have hidden in the panic, at least theoretically. This is the most common cause of death at Vortex Spring. To get as deep as possible into the tunnel, large air tanks have to be left behind on the way. And when the diver runs out of air, they want to escape as fast as possible, but often can't find the exit due to panic. But a very serious problem soon arose during the search for McDaniel. The cave exploration turned out so complicated and dangerous that one of the rescuers nearly died on the very first day. In the places the local divers were able to check, there was no trace of Ben's body, and only a few experts in the whole world could cover the entire mapped area of the cave. After 4 days of fruitless search, one of them was involved. The result of his work shocked everyone. Ed Sorensen is a veteran of cave diving. He has performed more than 2,500 dives, holds countless titles and awards, and most importantly, his experience is immense. Sorensen is known as a diver who can go where others cannot. He's regarded as the world's best underwater rescue operation, as well as body retrieval expert. He has taken part in the most complicated of them all. For example, he saved the junior soccer team from a flooded cave in Thailand. Ed Sorensen joined the search for Ben McDaniel 5 days after his disappearance. At the time, the man was taking part in a sea expedition 1,000 kilometers away. But when he found out about the dangerous cave incident, he arrived at Vortex Spring the following day. Fellow divers and other experts warned Sorensen that it was too dangerous to search in the heart of the cave. But the man wanted to find at least some proof of Ben's death under the water's surface so that his parents would at least know the truth. On August 22nd, Sorensen explored the cave 3 times. He used a diver propulsion vehicle to save time and oxygen. As a result, the divers swam for 520 meters, which is almost 30 meters farther from the end of the cave area marked on the map. Apart from that, in Ben's notes, the rescuers found a map of the cave with marking of the spots he likely swam into. Sorensen explored the cave 61 meters farther from the last such mark. Having thoroughly checked everything and put together all the facts, Sorensen came to a shocking conclusion. Ben was not in the cave, and perhaps he never had been. The diver found no body and, what's more, no evidence of the possibility it had been there. Firstly, McDaniel was 185 centimeters tall and weighed 95 kilograms. And that's 2.5 centimeters and 9 kilograms more than Sorensen. One of the world's most skilled divers said it was difficult for him to get inside the cave's depths, let alone inexperienced Ben. The cave turned out to be so narrow that, at times, the diver had to crawl, tightly pressing himself into the tunnel's floor and ceiling. So, there were no obvious and undeniable signs of human presence in those places. But the last dozen meters of the cave Ed explored were, in his own words, untouched. Suppose, for some reason, Ben's body was left unfound, although this seems highly unlikely. But if it had been there, the number of fish feeding on dead organic matter would have multiplied. But this never happened. Sorensen found no evidence McDaniel had been or stayed in the cave. Ben's parents were not satisfied with such results. They turned to the first explorers of the Vortex Spring Cave, Steve Keen. He was one of the first people who created a map of the cave in 2003. Keen dove 7 times, exploring the cave much more thoroughly than during the creation of the map. But after this, the man repeated Ed Sorensen's words: Ben wasn't there. The underwater search was accompanied by the same activities above the surface. Helicopters explored the swampy surroundings along neighboring rivers, but nothing was found. But there was one tiny little clue. 2 dogs, specifically trained to smell dead bodies in the water, arrived at Vortex Spring. Both dogs barked loudly near the pool with the entrance to the cave. It pointed to the fact that human remains could have been somewhere under the water's surface. But lab findings contradicted this. If there had been any decay processes in the water, the number of bacteria would have multiplied. But this wasn't the case. Tests were run 30 times during a few months following Ben's disappearance, and all of them showed nothing. Ben, being frantically able, the McDaniels continued financing the search for their missing son. They posted $54,000 bail to use an underwater device with remote operation. Ben's parents had hoped a machine would be able to get where the divers couldn't, but it didn't live up to the expectations. Due to technical issues, it couldn't go any farther than the humans. Desperate, the McDaniels couldn't or wouldn't understand that further search was too dangerous and pointless. They announced a reward of $10,000, hinting that there was no divers brave enough to finally find Ben's body. But the local authorities, the employees of Vortex Spring, and experienced divers didn't take this decision too positively. They were afraid the desire to get the money would put inexperienced divers in grave danger. The McDaniels did not heed those warnings. Instead, they tripled the reward, making it $30,000. At that point, it had been almost 2 years since Ben's disappearance. The McDaniels remained steadfast until another tragedy happened. In March of 2012, 43-year-old diver Larry Higginbotham died in the cave. He died just like most people in that cave. He got stuck in an uncomfortable spot and didn't manage to find the way out. There was no proof that Larry wanted to find Ben and receive the money. But after this tragedy, the McDaniels faced a crazy backlash from the public and canceled the reward. Apart from that, the couple had already started to learn to the theory that their son had been killed. But were there any motives and, most importantly, pieces of evidence of this? The police started considering all possible options back when Ed Sorensen said Ben wasn't in the cave. Later, in the course of the investigation, 4 main theories sprang to be, but each of them raises too many questions. First of all, there were hints of Ben possibly wanting to take his own life. A note he left for his parents a few days before going missing seemed pretty strange. The guy appeared to be saying goodbye. Ben's $50,000 tax debt also seemed to back up this theory. If we add the stress the man had been going through into the mix, 2 theories seem plausible. According to the first one, Ben suffered from depression and took his own life. The second theory states that he staged his disappearance to start a new life. But there is a lot of evidence against these hypotheses. If McDaniel wanted to escape, it would have been easier to do with cash. But his wallet with $1,000, as well as his bank account, remained intact. Besides, in his note, Ben promised to take care of his parents. He talked a lot about his plans and seemed cheerful. Apart from that, the man remembered how painful the death of his younger brother was for his parents. the McDaniels were sure Ben would never make them go through that again. Another theory the police considered was an actual accident in the cave. It's feasible that Ben could really have died during his last evening dive. It's just that, for some reason, the body wasn't found or noticed immediately and got eaten by underwater predators in the meantime. But in this case, it's unclear where was his diving gear, unless people had to do with Ben's disappearance. If McDaniel had really died in the cave, Eduardo Terran, the dive shop employee, would have been indirectly responsible for his death since he unlocked the gate for Ben, although the man wasn't authorized to enter the cave. Maybe seeing that Ben was dead, the man wanted to hide the accident. He could have taken the body out of the water and hidden it somewhere. But this story also seems too strange. The police interrogated Terran and his colleague, Chuck Cronin. The former honestly admitted to having allowed Ben into the cave. Both men also agreed to take a lie detector test and did it successfully. But there was information this assessment had been strange. Most often, the test takes a pretty long time. A lot of questions get asked, often repeated in different reiterations. But the Vortex Spring employees were only asked 3 questions. Apart from this, it's unclear why Terran and Cronin went for coffee that exact evening, although normally they would wait for Ben to begin decompressing, or why after an entire day they didn't notice Ben's pickup parked in the facility's outskirts while the man himself was nowhere to be seen. Although, of course, all this could have been a coincidence. Another huge argument in favor of the Vortex Spring employees' innocence was the absence of a body. The experts highlighted that dragging a body out of the cave at night was no easy task, but getting rid of the body without leaving any traces was even more difficult. But there was another theory. It claimed Ben could have been involved in a crime or ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. At night before his disappearance, a strange drunk man with wild eyes walked into the dive shop. The police heard about this from Vortex Spring owner Lowell Kelly. He was one of the last people to have seen Ben McDaniel. According to Kelly, a drunk man who looked around 35 years old appeared right after sundown and asked if it wasn't too late to go for a dive. Around that time, Ben was descending into the water. That strange man might have had something to do with McDaniel's disappearance, but it's unclear whether he even existed, and the reputation of Lowell Kelly himself turned out to be extremely dubious. 3 years earlier, in 2007, he was accused of kidnapping and assault. A former employee of the facility claimed Kelly had taken him into the woods and tried to beat him with a baseball bat, all because the employee had reportedly owed him thousands of dollars. In 2011, Kelly admitted his guilt. He was fined and sentenced to a 7-year probation. But the man was not destined to serve his sentence. Before the end of his first year of punishment, Lowell Kelly died under strange circumstances. It happened approximately 2 years after McDaniel's disappearance. But around this time, the investigation of his case was most active because a private detective had just joined in. So, in December of 2012, Lowell Kelly organized a big picnic at Vortex Spring. That day, he fell off a staircase and hit his head. One of the guests took Kelly home, helped him take a shower, and left him to rest. The next morning, the man's condition deteriorated. Then, he got hospitalized, where he died eventually. It's unclear why Kelly wasn't taken to the hospital initially, but this isn't the biggest mystery of this incident. The sheriff's office employees who led the Ben McDaniel case asked their colleagues to inform them about what had happened to Kelly, but they weren't given this information in its entirety. The sheriff's office also refused to publish Kelly's forensics report, although, by law, this information is supposed to be public. The office claimed this would compromise the ongoing investigation. It is unclear whether these cases are connected and whether any of the dead men had been involved with the criminal world. But the private detective hired by the McDaniels to investigate Ben's disappearance seemed to have found something else. According to her, some people connected to Vortex Spring had a criminal past. So, there were as many reasons to look for Ben's body above the surface as there were to look for it in the water. Finally, 16 divers had actively tried to find McDaniel in the cave for 36 days straight. All in all, the search continued for 2 more years at least. But after all investigations, the cave seems to be the only innocent party to this story. The disappearance of Ben McDaniel definitely looks like a human responsibility, either that of Ben himself or of those hiding the truth. And which one of the versions appears the most plausible to you? I hope there's no need to ask you to avoid swimming into dangerous caves, unlike hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel.